All right, here we go. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the topic of selling your practice in 2026. What advisors need to know about the value, multiples, and real outcomes to make the right decision about their succession. My name is Ben Thalen, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development with Advisor Legacy. And with me today is Todd Doherty, who is the Vice President of our Legacy Solutions team. Todd will be taking us through today's content, and I'm certain you'll find great value from his perspectives on the industry and how you can leverage that information for your practice. Before I turn it over to Todd, I just wanted to provide a quick overview of what we do. Advisor Legacy is a full service coaching and consulting company, and we've been helping financial advisors for over 20 years and actually 21 years this week. And we've supported over 2,000 financial advisors through our services. We're really driven by helping practices to build what we call is a legacy firm so that the practice that they built becomes one that outlives the founder and has generational impact. And we do that through a number of ways, but we really model that based on helping them to really build, live, and leave a legacy. And on the build side, we help them to develop their infrastructure and systems to create processes that allow the practice to scale. We also provide coaching that elevates the leadership strengths within the practice, whether that be the founder or the next generation business owner. And we're also mindful in building the enterprise value of the firm because, of course, that always is front and center for us in the work that we do with our teams. When it comes to the live bucket, we help founders to have independence from their practice, where they have the right operational structure to step away from the business and for it still to thrive even without their involvement. We also help to create capacity for leaders so that they can focus on the right activities to support with the practice growth. And we always ensure that the lifestyle alignment is considered so that the practice integrates with that of the founder's personal goals. And last but not least is the leave a legacy bucket, which Todd will spend some time on here today. And in this area, we help with succession planning and designing the ultimate legacy for the founder. We support with the transition of the practice from the founder to the next gen business owner through guidance as they take over the practice. And we always put your clients first, ensuring that there's continuity and stability through any transition that we support with. These areas tend to mean different things to different people, different practices, and we always welcome the chance to explore what this might mean to you. So if you have any questions and follow up to our presentation today on any of these areas, we'd be happy to schedule some time, with you or your team to learn more about your practice and your goals. Now, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Todd, and he'll take us through the remainder of today's content. We do have a chat box available for you so that if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, we'll be sure to hold those and we'll answer them at the end. So feel free to use that at any time. The microphones are turned off, so you can use it for that purpose, and we'll come back to it then. But with that, Todd, I'm going to pass the baton over to you to take us through the rest of today's content.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. Certainly, the transition of your practice for most financial advisors, if not all, is definitely one of the major milestones of your career and probably of your life as well. For most financial advisors, the value of their practice or the equity that they've built in it is their largest personal asset, or if it's not the largest, then it's certainly one of the larger personal assets. The average valuation today is hovering right around $3 million. So we've seen that grow significantly over the years, and certainly that's a very important asset for the advisor looking to transition. What we're really talking about today, given that is such an important milestone, is you really need good information to navigate the succession of your practice and the transition of your team and clients. And unfortunately, in our industry, there is a fair amount of misinformation out there, and that type of information is not helpful in making good business decisions. We hear a lot of hearsay. I mean, you can imagine in my where I sit, it's almost on a daily basis where people ask about they've heard about these extremely high multiples paid and so forth, and most of that is hearsay. A bit of it is also kind of creative terms on deals. But today we really want to walk you through what are the foundations of valuation, monetization of equity, and the realities of the market for selling your practice. And the real takeaways that I have, looking at this deck are really just three different things. So actual sales data, and I'll be sharing that data with you, really supports reasonable results and not so much the hearsay that tends to be common in our industries. The outliers, and there are outliers, there's always outliers, are really part hearsay and part reality. And in the reality of those outlier deals, they're generally based on increased risk to the seller. That's how we get those kinds of terms that show very high multiples. And then the last foundation is that really deals are based on cash flow. If it doesn't cash flow appropriately because the price or offer is too high, there's either an increased risk or it's not something that can be financed, and most deals today are financed by a lender. So that's the foundation. Let's jump into it, and I'm really going to hope to give you some very solid information that can help you make a very informed decision about your own succession or practice sale. So the first item I want to go through here is the data that we've created based on our own sales, and we've conducted hundreds of transitions over time. We've gone back for approximately the last 4 years of transactions and looked at the data of the actual results of sales. And this is based on the support that we give advisors through our deal support services and also our own practice listings. Unfortunately, there is no place in the industry where data is compiled, so no one can actually state that they have industry-wide data, but firms like ourselves who are specifically involved in the process of practice transitions have very good representative data. So what you're looking at here is what the data really points out is the way a practice is sold and transition has the biggest impact on monetization of equity. So if we start at the lower left hand side of this slide, you can see a multiple of 2.29. And when we refer to these multiples, we're going to use the most simple methodology possible, which is we're talking about multiples of gross revenue or gross GDC. So an average multiple of 2.29 is for what we call a closed sale. And a closed sale is defined as, the buyer and the seller have found each other, they've largely agreed to the price and terms on their own, and then, they complete the deal that way. That is the most common way that practices are transitioned, and by our estimates, it's about 70% of transitions. That average multiple is actually below average valuation, though, and so you can see as people are doing it on their own, they're not really maximizing monetization of equity. The next multiple that you see as we go up the ladder there, the stairs, is 2.41. And what that multiple represents is an internal, or what we call a next-gen sale. Those transitions are becoming more and more common. As practices get larger and larger, they tend to transition internally. And it's the fastest growing transition lane in our industry currently by our data. Next-gen deals are not really about the multiple. That's not the value proposition. So it's not the situation where you can negotiate a higher sale price, because it's almost 100% contingent on cash flow to the buyer who's moving from an employee to an owner. Where they find a lot of leverage is in the future growth of the business as the owner sells tranches of equity over time. As we move up the stairs there, you can see there's next higher multiple is pretty big difference from the starting point of a closed deal is a professionally negotiated closed deal. And so those are generally usually a seller, to be honest, and where the seller has a buyer, but they recognize they shouldn't DIY such an important transaction. They'll hire someone like ourselves to complete negotiate that for them. That takes us up to a multiple of 2.74. As we get to the top of the stairs there, you can see a really substantially improved multiple, and that's when you get to open market sales. To qualify that statement, not all open market sales are fully open market. Oftentimes, in our own open market sales platforms, the market is limited to the platform of the seller. So if there was a particular broker dealer, we often like to keep that buyer candidate pool limited to the broker dealer so we're not repapering. That doesn't always make sense for the seller, but if it does, then that could be what we call limited open market sale. But you can see there, that's the highest multiple average, 3.59 times the gross revenue, gross GDC. And if you apply that, that difference from a DIY to an open market sale, the difference is over $1 million. So it's significantly different depending on how you monetize. That being said, it is still the case that people are choosing closed deals on, as the majority of the way that practices are transitioned. It's always been that, being the case because I think they're choosing relationship over, other options. And I assume it will continue to be the case moving forward. The other foundational thing I want to talk about is, why is there so much hearsay in our industry? I think it really seemed to start to ramp up about 5 years ago or so, where we hear a lot about I know an advisor who sold for a multiple of 7, and or what about all of these private equity deals that we're hearing about and so forth. And really, there's most of the that falls into either hearsay or 3 primary buckets of deal terms, if you will, that tend to create more risk for the seller specifically. So I'm going to go through these in a little bit in depth on the one in the middle, the equity swap piece. But if you think about the fact that a deal needs to cash flow, that there has to be the appropriate net cash flow, that's net of expenses and the debt service for the acquisition. If it doesn't meet those requirements, then it can't be financed. And with the valuations today averaging $3 million, at least 90% of deals are financed by a lender. So cash flow becomes a really primary consideration. So the way that people can get around that, if they, in the outlier offers, is one of these 3 things that we're showing you here. So first, it is on occasion that we see buyers injecting their own cash into the deal. It's not an assumption I would make, taking your practice to market, that is going to be the case, because most will choose not to. But sometimes, there are practices that are quite large, have amazing cash flow, and they're willing to inject some cash and not have the same consideration of the return on that investment that they would if they're paying off the loan. So that's number 1, still an outlier, relatively rare, but it does happen. The one in the middle here, the equity swaps, is the most common, I would say, today. And this one is really representative of the deals that you might hear from about, private equity being involved as the funding agent of an RIA and so forth. And this is probably the one that represents more than any other why you can hear about these really high multiples, and you can see there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors involved. So what an equity swap looks like is, let's say I'm a large RIA firm. It's normally where that happens, and I want to buy your practice. I'm going to pay you for 50% of the equity today, and you're going to trade me 50% of the rest of the equity for 50% of equity for the 50% in my practice equity. So it's what's called an equity swap. I'm buying half of it, but the other half is a trade of equity for equity in my practice. Then what I'm doing in the offer is I'm saying you have a waiting period. It's usually 3 to 5 years or more until you can monetize the 50% equity swap by selling the shares that were traded for equity in my practice. What I'm also doing is I'm using a very aggressive growth model to show you what that will be worth 3 to 5 years in advance or further. And then when I'm growing that, the value of that through an aggressive growth in my own practice, and usually it's at least 25% that they're assuming, I'm taking that future value back to today's revenue, and that creates the multiple. So if you create a simple model like that, you can see why it can show multiples that are quite high, but that's not reality for a multiple for a fixed deal today. And it involves making some really significant assumptions on the seller's part that you're buying into A, what is the value of their practice today that you can't even determine, B, do you agree with those growth assumptions, and C, what if none of that happens? What if the value is overestimated? What if the growth doesn't happen? Where does that leave you? So that's generally how you get to really high multiples and a lot of the hearsay. The last one is more, been around the industry for quite a while, but earnouts take the risk away from the buyer largely, and what it allows people to do again is to project a pretty significant growth rate, and then that's shown as the potential price of an earnout, completely contingent on the actual results of revenue. So hopefully that gives you a feeling for what are some of the things that are creating actual outliers, and then also probably also create a lot of the hearsay that we experience. I want to shift now into what are the three primary drivers that impact deals, and this really gets us down into the reality of the information that you need. The first driver is, as I mentioned before, cash flow, and cash flow really is everything. When I refer to cash flow, you can see the model here. You have your gross revenue of the practice, then you have your operating expenses. Then from the buyer's perspective, you have the debt service for financing the acquisition. That leaves you with your free cash flow, if you will. And there's an appropriate margin for that, for that owner retained earning or free cash flow based on the opportunity costs and the risk to the buyer. So the cash flow is actually a measurable thing that we can say, this is the appropriate margin that a buyer should have to withstand stress testing of the model. And frankly, if it doesn't look appropriate, then it's not going to be approved by a lender. And that's why cash flow becomes so central. The other reason why this has, become more and more important over time actually is that in our industry years ago, we used to have a lot of what you would refer to as a book sale. And what that means is that largely the sale is of the client group, but there was no enterprise that went along with it. You're just buying the clients, absorbing them into your infrastructure, and you're not taking on, staff, office space, and so forth. Today, most sales are enterprise sales. And as that shift has happened over the last 10 years or so, cash flow and profitability have become more and more central considerations of both valuation and monetization of equity. So most sales, you are taking on the team, office spaces, all of those kind of things that go along with an enterprise business. So number one driver, cash flow has to be there. If your practice is not profitable, it's probably something you want to look at prior to considering a sale, because it can make a really significant difference in the monetization of equity. The second driver is deal structure, and as I had shown before, the way a practice is sold has more impact than terms, but terms are important. When we ask people who are selling what's most important to you of the three aspects of a sale, which is fit, price, and terms, normally they'll rank fit as number one, terms as number two, surprisingly, and then price. there's an old saying, in negotiating that, if you tell me the price, I'll tell you the terms. And if you tell me the terms, I'll tell you the price. And that's a very accurate statement actually, because those things go hand in hand. And this is another area where, if you think about, the possibility of these higher multiple deals, what you're also doing is you're tilting, the balance in respect to the amount of risk and the terms that you're willing to take to get that price. When I think about, I've been involved in hundreds of practice transitions over the years, there's two things that stand out to me. And one of them is you don't want a deal to be complicated. I think the more complication, the more stressful it is, probably the less satisfaction that comes out of, the closure of selling a practice. So that's number one. I mean, it's really helpful to keep things simple. And the other thing is simply, having the closure of a straightforward deal with clean terms, a clear, monetization that doesn't have a lot of contingencies and risk to the seller is very important. And, I think at the end of the day, once someone has gone through the process of selling and transitioning, those are the things that are really going to matter to them from a human perspective and not simply from a dollars and cents perspective. So high multiples generally have, more complicated terms, more risk in the terms, whereas, standard deal multiples in our industry that cash flow well can have very simple, very clean terms, higher down payments, and very little risk to changing the amount of the sale price. So deal structure, deal terms, very important foundational item in putting together a sale of your practice. The last driver is, something that I went through the results on, but, really is a clear differentiator in monetization of equity, and that is, the closed deal versus the open market type of sale having a significant difference in monetization supported by our average data. And the other thing I would say about this is interesting. I think the reason that people have always chosen closed deals more than any other lane for selling is, it's based on a long-term relationship they've had with an advisor that they know, and that creates a comfort level. But if you're vetting multiple candidates, actually, we find that the fit can be better. And this is one thing I think a lot of people don't take into consideration. They know the price is better, but they don't assume the fit is better. But oftentimes, when a practice is listed for sale, you might have the ability of vetting 30 candidates or more. We've had as many as 50 for our sales. And then, a process of narrowing down and choosing the best of a highly qualified group almost ensures the best possible fit that you can get. Also, that message is very well received by the clients, knowing that you took the time to do that. Not that closed deals don't result in a good fit, but it's hard to say if you selected someone many years ago and just assume that they would be a good fit based on a relationship that you currently have with them. So premium of competition is real. Definitely has a big impact, if not just on monetization, but I would argue also fit. The other advantage to that versus DIY deals is they're almost exclusively professionally managed by a team. So you have, start to finish support for every aspect of the sale, whereas DIY sales generally do most of the negotiating and structure on their own and planning of the transition on their own as well. Where we see the DIY deals is helping them largely with the legal paperwork. So those are really the three drivers that can, have a big impact on the outcome of your sale. And I would say, it's not just quantitative, but qualitative. I think, one of the things that I always keep in mind is not all value is monetary. There's a lot of value in selling that has to do with peace of mind. And it's definitely something to consider, when you're going through such a major milestone. It's also the case that selling tends to be quite an emotional process. It's not like you're selling a hard asset. You're transitioning relationships. Oftentimes, relationships that you've had for 20 or 30 years with your clients. The analogy I like to use, it would be like if you sold your house with your family in it, literally, because it is that important. And that creates a lot of emotion for the seller as they're going through the process of selling. As we move on through this, we do see some common mistakes that sellers make. So I want to just touch on those briefly. One of the things, fixating on the hearsay or that, kind of the headline stuff is very damaging to people. I've seen sellers who, without really any data, just having a really hard time letting that go once they hear those things and they have like a certain multiple in their head. And then when they start to interact with potential buyer candidates, it really poisons the well. And so, that type of misinformation and hearsay and, relying on outliers versus averages tends to be, it makes the process very difficult for a seller and is unnecessary. The second item here is, the fact that we've really moved towards enterprise sales and cash flow being really one of the primary drivers in price and terms, and that can't be ignored. A lot of advisors haven't really managed their P&L that well, and when it comes time to sell, that could be a surprise. And then the last one is, we've seen this very significantly, especially with the baby boomer generation, which I'm part of, in that people have delayed retirement, often to the point where I wouldn't say their clients are getting the best engagement, frankly, and the clients are aging. More often than not, they have not even told their staff or their clients when they plan to retire until they're actually in the process of selling. So this is the kind of thing that generally you want to start planning at minimum of 5 years ahead of your desired succession date. And the other takeaway I would have here is, this should never be a DIY situation. Again, at the very beginning, we mentioned how important this is, and it really should be handled by professionals to have the best, outcome, both, qualitative and quantitative. If we look at the market today, just to kind of wrap up, it is very good right now. There's no question that valuations are at an all-time high. We've seen incremental increases in value over the last really 15 years, as long as I've been doing them. And this is really the peak. The demand for practice sales is quite strong. It continues to increase year over year, interestingly. I don't think that will be the case for too much longer, but certainly it is today. The other really favorable thing is financing is readily and easily available. So almost any potential buyer can go out and fund an acquisition. It's not difficult to get approved, and there's many, many, many options of different lenders and different programs. And then, lastly, you really need to focus on making sure you're ready to sell, and you're going to get, you have the right information to get the best monetization of equity, the best closure for yourself, the best outcome for your staff and your clients. And really, the starting point for pretty much all of this, when we look at, how do people get started in considering the sale and transition of their practice, is with a valuation. Valuations give just a wealth of information about, when is the timing, when's your equity going to peak and start to decline, if there's some things that you can do to improve it, depending on the time frame that you have left before your exit, all of those things. And in our own valuation process, once we get the valuation deliverable done, we spend 45 minutes going through it with you and talking about, this is what we see, here's what you can do, depending on why you get the valuation. It tends to be one of the best meetings that most advisors and owners have regarding their practice. So that's the good place to start. If any of you want to follow up on any of that, on the next slide, you'll see my contact information. So if you happen to have your phone handy, take your phone out and take a shot at those QR codes. I'm happy to meet with anybody that has questions. If you want to talk about the future of your practice or succession, valuation, any of that, certainly would enjoy spending time with you. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Ben. Hopefully, some of you have some questions today. Be happy to answer your questions. And Ben?
Yeah, Todd, thank you. And just wonderful content here, just in the truly in the vein of how the acquisition space is considered. It see a lot of advisors make some mistakes in this area because of some of the myths that you described, and shedding light on this is so important so that what ends up being the most important decision that an advisor makes in their whole career, or one of, if not the most important, that they get that decision right. So thanks for all the great stuff that you took the group through here today. I don't currently see any questions in our chat box here, but I'll wait just a moment for anybody that wants to jump in with any questions for Todd.
Well, we must have done a good job.
That's right. You got it. Well, knowing that there are none in the chat here, I do just want to reiterate what Todd said is that you can reach out to him via the QR code that you see listed here. You can also go to our website and fill out a contact us submission, and we will certainly follow up with you. Todd would be happy to have a conversation about your situation and see if there are ways for us to support you. So. Todd, thank you again for the great content you took the group through here today. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday.